Lechi lach to a land that I will show you. Lech lecha to a place you do not know.
Chat section.
Sounds good.
Okay, Julia, all you.
Hey, Akiva. Good
Shalom.
to see you. Hi. So, ladies and gentlemen, as Ilan just said, we will officially start our presentation in a second. I'm happy and privileged to introduce Akiva Gersh of Lochamei Ghettoot Ghetto Fighters Museum at Kibbutz Lochamei Ghettoot. We have a special presentation for Yom HaShoa, for the Holocaust Day. And I do feel a bit ashamed. I will take just one more minute from you, Akiva. But since quite a few of the participants now participated in this wonderful event when we saw the movie about the Mossad looking for me, and then this doll was used. Okay, so whoever saw the movie, the doll made it today to Moshav Maor in Israel, and here she is. She will be right next to me at all times. And she has a name, of course. Her name is Corona. COVID-19, okay, because otherwise, she would never be born, and nothing of what is going on here would have happened. So her name is Corona, and she also has a Hebrew name, a Jewish name, which is Malka. Okay? Malka is a queen, and that's because Corona means a crown in English, and so this is Corona Malka, and she will be placed right here, so you will be able to see her on Zoom. And my daughter was so happy to receive it. I just have to show you one photo because it is so special, so I will share my screen.
I'm also going to mute everyone else, Julia, so unmute yourself, but I'm going to mute everyone else. Julia, you're on mute. Oh, it's wonderful.
So this is the photo I wanted you to see. This is my daughter Yael, and she's so happy to get the doll. She was the one who got to the post office and got it, and so that's how they spend the afternoon. Okay, Noam is right here next to the guitar. You don't see him, but this is Corona Malka and Yael. Okay, in Moshav Maor. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing. That's it. Akiva, apologize. It's all yours. Thank you in advance. And please, guys, it is pay as you wish. So please be generous. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yulia, first, I just want to say I didn't realize that we were basically neighbors. I'm from part of this Chana. So we're like right down the road from each other. That's very cool.
I had no idea. I thought you're living up north. Anyhow, we will talk about it later. Okay.
Exactly. I've been just one last little thing because we have to, because we're Jews. Right? I've been dropping off my son lately at Moshav Maor to hang out with a friend of his there because he has an awesome pull-up bar, and that's what he and all of his friends love doing. So I'm getting to know Maor very well. So first of all, I just want to say thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor. To be here and to be part of this presentation and part of this program and part of this day. Obviously, without having to say, but I'll say it anyway, this day is such a powerful day. And here in Israel, we're obviously ending, or we already technically have ended Yom HaShoa, but we're continuing it with this program with all of you in all the different places that you're in. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm not originally from Israel. I'm originally from New York. Maybe you can still hear my New York accent. I'm not sure. I've been living here for almost 17 years, so it's kind of fading away maybe. The New Yorker in me is, putting up a good fight. I have not picked up an Israeli accent. I never expect to, but definitely have learned a good amount of Hebrew along the way. And Yom HaShoa obviously is a very powerful day. I can literally spend the next hour just talking about the experience of Yom HaShoa and being a Jew living in this land, raising Jewish children in this land on this day. That's not what I'm going to do, but I could. And I'll just maybe go off script for just a moment before I officially begin and just say this morning, I went out to what we call the Moshava, the central area of my town, which is a few minute walk from my house. And I went with my kids who are still staying home from school. and we went out for the siren. As you might know, on Yom HaShoa, on Holocaust Remembrance Day here in Israel, we have a nationwide siren. All right, that is sounded and heard throughout the entire country, from Eilat in the south to, the Golan Heights in the north. Every single town, every single city, every kibbutz, moshav. Kids are in school; they're hearing it as part of a ceremony in their schools. And for me, I would imagine the same thing goes for anyone living here, native Israelis included. But for me, as someone who wasn't born here and I was not raised here, but moved here on my own later in life, to experience that siren and to know that when I'm standing there in silence, hearing that silence and thinking about the 6 million, that the entire country is doing the same thing, that more than 6 million Jews now, more than 6 million Jews, right, living in Israel are standing and listening to that siren. I mean, that sums up for me the power of the Jewish people returning to their homeland and the power of living in this land. And and this year, for the second time in a row, because last year, with Corona, there was no school at all, to stand there with my own children who were born in this land, that's like a whole nother level. So just wanted to share that snippet, that personal experience from Israel, what happened today, this morning. So let's begin. I will say I've been teaching about the Holocaust for many, many years, but it is still a daunting task. I will say, of all the topics that I teach, and I teach a wide range of Jewish topics, Israeli history topics. Whenever I teach the Holocaust, I feel very, very humbled, and I feel a little bit even apprehensive, because it is such an enormous topic, bigger than myself, obviously. But I'm happy to share with all of you what I know, what I've learned, and what I think is really important to know, and what I think is really powerful to know. And I think it's really incredible that we're focusing on this specific museum today, Lochamei Ghettoot. You know what? I'm just going to pin myself here, so maybe just people can see me better. I'm not sure if people can already see me, but here we go. Okay, hello. I think the fact that we're focusing on this museum, Lochamei Ghettoot, the Ghetto Fighters Museum, the Ghetto Fighters House, is really significant, is really important, because the truth is, outside of the land of Israel, outside of the state of Israel, a lot of people don't know this museum. I had the merit to work for an organization here, an educational institution, for many, many years in Israel, who took their students to this museum as part of their Holocaust education. That's how I personally got to know it. But I know my friends who made Aliyah, who moved to Israel from the States, just like I did, they probably never even, have been there. But it is really one of the most important Holocaust museums, I think, in the world. So I'm really, really, I feel, again, the honor to be able to share that with you. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to start. We're going to jump right into it. We're going to visit virtually this tremendous place, this important place. And we'll share, pieces of it. Just like the Holocaust, is endless, and we can't talk about it in 1 hour. Even this one museum, right? We can't talk about it in 1 hour. It would take days to thoroughly go through this museum, even virtually. But I'm happy to share a few parts of this museum that I chose, Julie and I chose together to really highlight and to share with you. So here, Beit Lochamei Ghettoot, right? The Ghetto Fighters House Museum. Even the name, right? Just think of the name. The name itself, I think, is so powerful. The Ghetto Fighters Museum. I mean, where do you hear that phrase? Where do you hear a kibbutz, a community named after, ghetto fighters, fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto and other survivors of the Holocaust? And the name itself is such a powerful name, and the name itself is such a statement of the founders of this kibbutz, right? And we'll talk about that as we go on. But who they were and what they did and what they wanted to do when they came to the land of Israel. All right, I think it's important to know. Here's an aerial view of the museum itself. It is located right next to, adjacent to the kibbutz itself, named, the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz. When you're driving on the road, it's way up north along the coast. It's just about 10 minutes or so away from the Lebanese border. All right, so it's in the area of Nahariya. For those who know that area, as you get towards Rosh Hanikra, right on the coast. You're driving on Highway 2, right? It's still Highway 2 up there. And to the left is the ocean, and to the right, you're seeing the kibbutz. You're seeing the museum. And this museum was the first Holocaust museum ever created. Right? That's important to know, 1949. Right after survivors of the Holocaust, members of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which we'll talk about, came to Israel and set up a kibbutz, right, to keep the memory of what happened to them and what they did in Europe alive, and of course to honor those who didn't make it out alive. Right. I think it's so important to say. I'll say it now just so I don't forget later, but I'm sure I'll say it again. That of the Jews that went into the Warsaw Ghetto, and that number was almost 500,000 Jews just in the Warsaw Ghetto. Right? Very, very few survived the war. Very, very few survived the war. And some of those survivors came to the land of Israel, came to the state of Israel, and they established a kibbutz, right? Holocaust survivors, right? Establishing a kibbutz, establishing a home in this land. And at the same time, like almost in the same moment that they established their home, right, they're establishing this museum, right, to make sure that we in the world never forget. I think it's also important to note, hold on one second, I hope this is not blocking anything, that the official name of this museum, right, is the Yitzhak Katznelson Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Heritage Museum Documentation and Study Center. Right, and it was named after Yitzhak Katznelson, a Polish Jew who was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was a writer, he was a poet. He wrote a very important and famous piece about the experience of the Jewish people in the Holocaust, called The Song of the Massacred Jewish People. He unfortunately did not make it out alive. He was arrested and deported by the Nazis and eventually brought to Auschwitz, where he was killed in 1944. But his manuscript survived. There's only a few copies of this book that he wrote, documenting what happened to the Jewish people. And one of those manuscripts made it out safely and to the land of Israel, and incredibly got published. You can find that online if you want to Google that now or later. So that's Yitzhak Katznelson, right, who this museum is named after. Right? He was one of the resistance fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He, along with other members of the uprising, of the ghetto fighters, they knew that and we're going to get into the uprising a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but I just want to say, since we're talking about Katznelson right now, that he knew, like the others, that there's no way they're going to defeat the Nazis, right? There's no way. But we have to fight anyway, because we have to leave our mark on history. We have to let the Jewish people know, right, that we didn't go down without a fight. And that's such an important piece, right, of the story of the Holocaust. I know a lot of people don't know about resistance, physical resistance, spiritual resistance. When I grew up, I learned a lot about the Holocaust. That was probably like the #1 Jewish topic that I learned about. And in Hebrew school, and for my family, my own family, I should share, just so you know me a little bit personally, I had a very, very deep connection with the Holocaust growing up. My grandparents on my mother's side both were from a small shtetl in Poland. They fortunately left a good 10 or so years before the Holocaust, but the rest of their families didn't. My grandfather, one of 10 children, the youngest. My grandmother, one of 13 children, the youngest. And almost their entire families didn't leave and were killed in the Holocaust. And these were things I heard about growing up. I heard stories. I saw my relatives with numbers, tattooed on their arm. It was a very early memory for me. And yet I never learned about resistance, never, until I was like an adult. I mean, it's shocking to me now, right? But it's such an important piece of the story. And that's why this museum has the word resistance in it, because the Israeli connection to the story, the Israeli telling of the story, the Israeli understanding of the story, and the Israeli, I would even say, psychology of the story, of course, includes the tragedy, of course, includes the darkness and the suffering and the killing, right? But it also includes the resistance. You can't understand the Shoah, you can't understand the Holocaust fully without understanding Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, and again, physically and spiritually. We'll get more into that a little bit as we focus on the Warsaw Ghetto. All right, but moving on. It's interesting to note that, the group that formed the kibbutz, they already became a group even before they came to the land of Israel. This is a picture that was taken in their DP camp in Germany. All right, they were already a collective. Look at them. Really, just take a moment and look at this picture. Look at the faces. I think you'll probably notice right away what they all have in common. Right, they're all young. They're all very young. Right, and by the end of the Warsaw Ghetto, they were probably the only members of their family still alive. Right, and by the end of the war, for sure. And so their family became their friends became their family, and their kibbutz became their family. Right? They came to Israel, they set up a kibbutz, and they had no extended family, no siblings, no parents, no cousins, no aunts or uncles. Right? It's like literally starting all over again. In one of the diaries of a woman who lived in the Krakow ghetto, her name was Julia. And she writes in that, of course, as they watched their family members be killed or die from the hunger, the sickness, whatever took their lives, of course they were saddened, of course they were mourning. But they also spoke about this freedom that they felt, as that happened. And they joined together with the other young, Jews, the other young members, so to speak, not members, that's not a good word, but the younger generation, and became family together. And they felt this sense of, again, we can't understand their psychology, we can't understand their mindset, but she writes in her journal that she felt like a little bit of a burden lifted, that she didn't have to take care of her parents anymore. She didn't have to worry about them day in and day out and their survival. Right? Of course she wanted them alive. Of course she would do anything to keep them alive. But now that they were gone, there was a certain, a certain energy that kind of was released and motivated her to focus on other things. Right? Again, something I don't think we could ever fully understand, right? As people who are not in that experience. Here's the beginning of the kibbutz. Right. This is an Ottoman aqueduct in the background that you can still see standing today. It's one of the telltale signs of the kibbutz in this area. And they started off, they just, like many of the early Israelis, they just, plotted down on the land and set up some tents. There were some British army buildings in the area there that they used as well. And from nothing, they created an entire life for themselves, literally from nothing. Right. I want to go into the museum. And we're going to use some pictures from the museum itself, and then I've added other pictures to help us tell the story. But we're going to focus, as I said before, on a few different parts in the museum. And one of the parts focuses, as you can imagine, on Warsaw itself, right? The city, the life, the culture. I mean, Warsaw before the war was had the second largest Jewish population after New York City. Its life, its culture was vibrant. It was diverse. If you visit ever Warsaw, and if you haven't yet, I hope that you one day will. I've been there many, many times leading groups to Poland to learn about the Holocaust in the cities and in the camps. And when you go to Warsaw, most of the city was destroyed as a result of the war. So there's very little left of the original Warsaw. But the cemetery, right, it was left intact. And you go to the cemetery, and it sounds like a strange thing, but through the cemetery, you can learn about the life of the people that lived there. Right? Their graves even tell their story. Were they religious? Were they not religious? Were they socialists? Were they communists? Were they Bund? Were they Zionists? Were they anti-Zionists? Were they, Hasidim? All these different telltale signs on their graves. It's an incredible thing because it shows us, even today, after all that life got destroyed, how vibrant the Jewish life was in Warsaw. Right. So we're already starting with this in the museum here. We have to understand the life of the Jews before the war, right, to really understand what got lost as a result of the war and the Shoah. So here, the Warsaw Ghetto, it's a huge story. I'm going to try to move through it, swiftly, but still with helpful information, I hope. The Warsaw Ghetto was, the war begins on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invade Poland. And after about 4 weeks, Poland falls to the Nazis. Obviously, it was no match militarily. And about a year into the war, the Warsaw Ghetto is formed. we said before that the city had a huge population. About 300,000 Jews were living there, and the Nazis took those Jews and about another 150,000 Jews from the area around the city and put them into a ghetto inside the city, right? That made up about 2% of the city, right? And just by the numbers alone, you had about half the city being pushed into an area that was 2% of the city on the ground. Right, a wall was created. Some ghettos, there were about 1,000 different ghettos all throughout Europe that the Nazis built or had built. Some of them were so small that no wall was needed, no fence was needed. There were just armed guards making sure Jews didn't run away. Warsaw being so large, they had a wall constructed all around the ghetto. And who built the wall? It was the Jews themselves. The Nazis made the Jews build their own prison. And so here are pictures of Jews building the wall that's going to keep them in. Right, inside the ghetto and keep them from going out, right? Making that separation between them and the rest of the population of Warsaw, really them and the rest of the population of Poland. Right, here's another picture of the Jews building that wall. And you can see, just on one side of the wall, there's the ghetto. On the other side, there's kind of relative normal life. Yes, the war was happening, of course, but people were milling around and going to stores, and there were bakeries, right? And as you see in the picture on the left, walls were just constructed right in the middle of a street, in between apartment buildings. As we said before, Warsaw was almost completely destroyed as a result of the war. But if you go to Warsaw today, you can see a couple places, small pieces of the wall still intact. And just like in this picture on the left, the one that I've visited many times with students, it's just right in between apartment buildings. You feel bad visiting it because there's all these people living there, right? And you have to keep your voice very quiet so you don't disturb the people in the area. But it just reminds you of just like, boom, this wall just, so to speak, lands and just completely changes the lives of the Jews. Jews who are part of Poland, they're part of Warsaw, they're part of the life, they're part of the culture. Right? I mean, it was such a Jewish city, and in the way that New York City is such a Jewish city today, right? That was Warsaw back then. The non-Jewish Poles, the Christian Poles, they knew Judaism. They saw Yiddish signs every day of their lives. They heard Yiddish. It was part and parcel of their life, right? Which is why, on a very, very quick aside, that's a whole nother topic, but very interesting to learn about why today, for many years now, there's this renaissance in Poland today, looking for that Jewish life. Right? Non-Jewish Poles is an unbelievable thing. I know many Christian Polish people who are learning Yiddish, who are learning Hebrew, who are studying Jewish history or teaching Jewish history, right? Because they feel like the soul of the people, of the Jewish people is still there, but their physical bodies are no longer there, right? Moving on. I want to go into the Warsaw Ghetto, an intense picture right away, but the goal of the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto was to kill the Jews, right? Just imprison them in, build the wall, give them nothing to eat, and let them die. Right? We said almost 500,000 Jews were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and the goal was to have them die from starvation, from the cold, from the illnesses and the sicknesses that were rampant inside. The Germans, we know, were very organized. And they determined, according to each ethnicity, how much a person would receive in calories each day. Right? And they actually have a chart. Right? I have it on a different computer, trying to find it to share it with you, but know that it exists. A picture of the original chart where the Nazis, from the Germans all the way down in the war, who got how many calories, how much percentage of their regular intake of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. And as you can imagine, the Jews were at the bottom of the list. According to this list, Jews were to receive 181 calories a day. 181 calories a day. If you have ever had, and I'm sure you have, had a package of a granola bar, say Nature Valley or something like that, that's already 250 calories approximately. That is more than the Jews were allotted per day in the Holocaust. Now, of course, no one could live like that, and that's why many people died. Right? We'll get back to how some of them were able to get extra food, but this is their fate. Look at this picture. And here's a child freezing. I mean, look what he's wearing. Right? You can barely even call it clothing. It's just rags tied up on rags, because they were left with nothing. And when something rips, which it will, especially if you wear it every single day, and you have a gaping hole in your pants, you can't walk around a Warsaw winter like that. So you find a rag and you tie it on, and another rag and another rag. Look at his shoes. Those aren't shoes. Those are pieces of fabric tied around his feet. And this is a classic picture of a kid, of a person in the Warsaw Ghetto in the wintertime, trying to keep warm. Here are children. It might not be the clearest picture, right? But here are children. If we weren't gathered together in Yom HaShoa today, and I showed you this picture just out of the blue, you would think that this is a third world country. You wouldn't think these were Jews. Poland, right? Look at this. Kids huddled up on the streets. Maybe their parents have died already. Maybe their parents are dying. Maybe their parents are doing the same thing just down the street. Hey, this is the experience of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Look at this. I mean, especially this picture does not look like Jewish children. How we would ever, I mean, we wouldn't want to imagine any children looking like this. But just from so many pictures we've seen in our heads through the media, this is something that comes from the third world. And this was the experience of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, right? Children begging, right? Hoping that somebody gives them a handout to survive another day. Again, a picture that tells, 1,000 words. Look at this kid eating, whatever little bite of food that he has. Look at his legs. Look how thin they are. And look at, again, his shoes, right? Those are not shoes. Those are not shoes that we would let our kids walk out of the house with, ever, right? But that's all he's got, right? And this is the experience. These pictures really capture the experience. And I'm sorry for this intense picture. I really apologize, right? But I think it's an important picture to see as well. Right? You and I, we see this picture and we're horrified, obviously, of the child either dead or dying on the floor, but also and you can tell from the picture that the people looking at this child are moving. There's movement happening in this picture, and we're horrified. How can you walk by a child like that and just stare and move on? Glance to your left and move on. But we have to remember that they saw this every single day of their lives in the Warsaw Ghetto. They probably saw that 5 seconds ago. They'll see it in 5 seconds more. Right? This was, again, what was happening in the ghetto and what the Nazis wanted to happen in the ghetto, that the Jews die on their own without us having to really do much of anything. Now, the children played a very special role in the ghetto, right? Because they were small enough and agile enough to sneak out of the ghetto. As we said before, nobody can live on 181 calories a day, and they didn't. The head of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto, Adam Chernikov, he ordered that people grow vegetables in every single empty plot in the ghetto to add to the food that people have. And on top of that, the kids would sneak out every single day, here climbing over walls, breaking through walls. They would escape on a daily basis. Sometimes they would escape the ghetto, go into the regular side of Warsaw and pick up anything, potato peels, scraps of food, a little piece of moldy bread, and bring it back to their families. And think about it, these kids, they experienced freedom whenever they did that, but they always returned to the ghetto because they knew that they were the lifeline for their family, right? If they ran, if they kept going, if they didn't come back, their families for sure would die, right? So just that moral, dilemma that was on their shoulders every single day, that responsibility. Moving on into the museum, in this section about Warsaw, of course, it talks about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right, which is a huge and important story. And the museum does an incredible job of telling the story. I've sat there many times with students, going through the exhibition, telling them the story. And just, such a powerful thing, to tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the first Holocaust museum ever created by Holocaust survivors, by Warsaw Ghetto survivors, right, who built this place exactly so that people like us should come and learn the story. It's an unbelievable thing. Right, so I just want to share a little bit about the uprising as well. Here is, let's say like this. Again, it's a big story, and I'll just kind of give, general strokes about it. We said that the ghetto was set up in 1940, October 1940. All right, 2 years later, almost 2 years later, in July 1942, on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, the Germans begin liquidation. Think about that for a second. Was that random? Did they know it's Tisha B'Av? Did they know it's the 9th of Av? Yes. The Germans knew the Hebrew calendar, and they used it as a psychological weapon against the Jews. They chose certain Jewish dates for certain actions or liquidations, killings of the Jews, deportations. And the Warsaw Ghetto was the first liquidation took place on Tisha B'Av 1942 in the summer. And that round of liquidations, that first round, lasted for 2 months, a few months, 2 or 3 months, right, into the fall of 1942. And during those 2 months, about 250,000, 250,000 Jews were removed from the Warsaw Ghetto and murdered, most of them in Treblinka. Okay? Before that, I should note, 100,000 Jews had already died from the sicknesses and the starvation from the ghetto. So by the time we get to the end of 1942, 3/4 almost of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were dead. Okay? Those that remained now fully understood what the Germans were doing, because at first the liquidations, they were told to go to this place called the Umschlagplatz. It's where the trains came into the ghetto, and they were told you're going to go to a better place. We're going to transport you to the east. We're going to reposition you, relocate you to the east. And after 2 years of the horrors of the ghetto, who could imagine things could get any worse? So when the Germans said, we're relocating you, we're taking you out of the ghetto, that to them was like salvation. And they went onto the trains. You see pictures of Jews organizing, themselves and getting onto the trains and listening to the orders of the Germans. And we want to scream at them and say, no, don't go on. Don't listen to them. You don't know what's coming. But that's exactly it. They didn't know, right? At that time, the knowledge was lacking, and they thought, again, nothing can get worse than the Warsaw Ghetto. It has to be better than this. Unfortunately, we know how wrong they were. By the end of 1942, we have about 50 to 60,000 Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in January 1943, the Germans are going to renew the liquidations. And the Jews who are surviving, they knew that they were going to come back for them. So in the few months in between, they started to organize. They started to smuggle in any weapons they could into the ghetto. They started to organize into groups and have tactics and plans when the Germans do come back, what we're going to do. And that became the uprising. Right? In January 1943, there was somewhat of an organized, underground, so to speak, made up of a few different organizations representing mostly different youth movements and political affiliations. And they were ready. They were getting ready for the Nazis to come in. And this movement had leaders. One of them was this man, Mordechai Analevich, in his young 20s, 23 years old. Mordechai Analevich, right? So his whole community died. And he is ready when the Nazis come back to take us or try to take us. We're not going to go down without a fight. We're not going to walk to the trains this time, right? And so when the Germans did come back in January 1943, they told everyone, either you get ready, you get into position, or you go and hide. Don't listen to the Germans. Don't follow their orders. Don't report. And when the Germans came in January 1943, they were shocked. They were met with a frontal onslaught led by Mordechai Analevich. Now, most of the Jews in that frontal assault died. Mordechai was one of the few survivors, right? But even though they died, they were, one, able to kill Nazis along the way. And number two, they were able to show themselves and the Nazis that the Jews are going to fight this time, that the Jews are not going to go down without a fight. And guess what? The Nazis retreated. The Nazis, after 3 days of fighting in January 1943, retreated. They left the ghetto. They stopped the liquidation. The Jews were dancing in the streets. They had killed Nazis. They had taken guns. They had exploded, Nazi military vehicles. It was an unbelievable victory for the Jews still inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Mordechai Analevich was joined by a woman named Tzivia Lubetkin, also a young Jew. She came from a middle-class Jewish family, and she got involved in the resistance. She got involved with the underground. Even before the war, she was involved with political organizations. 1 month before the war, she found herself in Switzerland at conference about Zionism. And at that conference, she was given a pass to go to Palestine. And she said, no, I need to go back to my people in Poland. That was 1 month before the war began. This Akiva Lubetkin becomes a major and important leader in the resistance in general in Poland, and specifically in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She will lead alongside Mordechai Analevich, as well as this man, Antek, or Yitzchak Zuckerman. Right? And I'll just give it away a little bit that these two, well, we'll get there a little bit later. Okay? But these three, Mordechai, Tzivia, and Antek, or Yitzchak, they lead this crazy idea of young Jews, barely armed, not trained, fighting against the Nazi military machine. But they did it for those points that we mentioned before, right? To make sure that the Nazis and the Jews and the world knows that the Jews are not going down without a fight, right? And it was also as a protest to the silence of the world. That was also part of their mission, to protest the silence of the world, right? As to what was happening to the Jews. These are other female members of the Jewish resistance, of the underground, of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Look at them, they're young. Again, like we said before, their families are probably all dead by now, right? At this point, I think it's so important to note that most of these members of the resistance, of the underground, of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they were on their way to Palestine. They were Zionists. They had been dreaming to move from Poland to Palestine. They were on their way, and then the war broke out and stopped that process in the tracks. Most of them never got to Palestine, never got to fulfill their dream of living in Israel, right? Because they died in the Holocaust. But I just want to say and point out, because it's so important to understand the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and resistance in general in the Holocaust, that they took that Zionist spirit that I'm sure you guys know about, that Zionist spirit of coming to the land and building from nothing and doing something that's crazy, but you have to do it because you have to do it. And they took that spirit and they took that energy and they focused it on where they were and what was happening in their reality. It was like Zionism in Poland, Zionism in the Warsaw Ghetto. That was that same spirit, that same energy focused on the fight against the Nazis. For their survival, yeah, let's hope. But they knew that their chances of survival were slim, but they were going to do it anyway because that's what it meant to be a Jew, and that's what it meant to be a Zionist. Never to give up. Take on the impossible dream. All right, to take on the impossible feat and like run straight at it. And that's what they did. Another woman who was part of this resistance in this underground, Jutta Teitelbaum, she was young. She was 22 years old when she got involved with resistance. The picture here doesn't really show it so clearly, but she had like blonde hair and she used to braid them and she looked even younger. She looked like a teenager. And she used her youthful look and her kind of, way with people to basically infiltrate into Nazi offices and headquarters. She helped smuggle weapons. She was a courier. She helped to pass on information between the Jewish resistance and the Polish resistance against the Nazis on both sides of the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. She did so much to help the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. One of the main stories told about her is that one day she walked into the Gestapo offices in Warsaw, right? They didn't know that she was Jewish. And she just kind of, shook her head a little bit and said, I'm here to see so-and-so, right? I have an appointment with him. And the Nazi guy in charge just like kind of waved her in. And she walks into this Nazi, officer's office and says, hello. And then takes out her gun with a silencer and points it at her and shoots him dead. That's her. She also, on another instance, shot and killed 2 other Nazi officers, wounded a third, found out where this third one was being kept, in which hospital, went to visit him, posed as a doctor, walked into his hospital room with a gun with a silencer again, and shot him dead. These are the people we're talking about in the Jewish underground in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right? These are the people. She unfortunately was caught by the Nazis a couple months after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was done. She was tortured for many weeks and eventually executed. But she was literally on the top 10 wanted list of the Nazis. They called her Little Wanda with the braids because of how she used to wear her hair. And this is the fierceness of the members of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and specifically the women. I think it's really important to highlight that. And these women were full on, right? Intense, in your face, do whatever to fight back and to fight for their people. Right? And again, we see that incredible parallel between them and the Zionists and the female Zionists. And again, that's like a whole other story, maybe for another time. But another very little known fact about Zionism is that the Zionist movement, I mean, it's the first movement that I know about that basically took on like feminism. Already in the early 1900s, when Jews started to come to the land of Israel from Russia, right, mainly, and young men were arriving and young women were arriving, and the men, went out to the fields and they got the guns and they did guard duty, and the women went into the kitchen and cleaned and cooked. And eventually they said, what's going on here? We also sacrificed everything. We also left everything behind to become part of this dream. We don't want to just be stuck in the kitchen. We want to do the farm work. We want to milk the cows. We want to learn how to use guns. And guess what? They did, right? They became equal members of the Zionist movement. They became guards. They became farmers. And that was decades, right, before the feminist movement that we know of in the West took off. Right? And you see that also in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's an incredible thing to note, I believe. I have this little note for myself because I want to show you a quick clip. It's part of a bigger movie called Uprising. And I think it's really important to know about, to see. We're just going to watch a couple of minutes, but it gives such a powerful visual of what the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising looked like. All right, the few against the many, the weak, so to speak, militarily against the strong. I'll just show a couple of minutes. I'm always a little scared to show videos over Zoom, but we're going to do it because I think it will add to our understanding. Oops, not that one. This is the one I want. Okay, here we go. We're just going to watch a couple of minutes. The sound. Oh, wait, hold on. I need to optimize for sound. Good. I'm glad I remembered that. We'll just watch a couple of minutes fighting between the ghetto fighters, Warsaw Ghetto fighters, and the Nazis coming in to liquidate them.
That's your boy, Marek. Marek, wake up! Shoot, wait. No? Not yet. No. 6 months. Dozens of our men were killed, more wounded at the brush makers.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to stop it there, but I really wanted you to see that one image of that girl tied to the roof and swinging around and throwing a Molotov cocktail. And as we said before, it was an impossible task. It was an impossible mission. But the truth is that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted for almost 4 weeks, and lasted almost as long as the entire Polish army lasted for against the Nazis. It's also important to note right now that while International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is in January, is aligned with the liberation from Auschwitz in 1945, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day aligns with is the date of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Right? That in and of itself tells you so much about the different Israeli, even the unique Israeli kind of connection and perspective of the Holocaust. Again, not forgetting ever the tragedy, the darkness, the murder of the 6 million, but also not allowing the stories of resistance to be forgotten either. Okay, so I'm going to kind of move through here, just ending this part with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Eventually, the Germans realized that the fight was too hard against the Jews, and instead of trying to fight the Jews, they went to fire and they started burning down the ghetto. They went street to street, building after building, burning down the ghetto, putting poison gas into bunkers. There were like 600 bunkers formed by the Jews in the ghetto itself. Those who were not fighting were hiding in bunkers. When fighters weren't fighting, they were hiding in bunkers. And they flooded them, they poison gassed them, and eventually they destroyed the entire ghetto. So by the end of the uprising, this is what the ghetto looked like. A chunk of the city completely demolished by the Nazis. But like members of the resistance themselves said, even if we were not able to defeat the Nazis, right, we are still able to go down in history, in Jewish history, as having resisted against the Nazis. Hold on one second. I'm hearing some background noise. I'm just going to mute everybody. Okay. Going down in history as having fought against the Nazis, right, and not having not done anything. Such an important thing. Mordechai Analevich, one of the leaders, he died in that ending time of the ghetto uprising. Most people believe he took his own life along with other members of the bunker where he was at the time, instead of the Nazis getting them. But Sivia Lubetkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman, they actually survived. And guess what? They came to Israel and they got married. And what did they do? They helped to form the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz. They are two of the founding members of the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz and the museum, as we said before, the world's first Holocaust museum. An incredible thing to know about as well. Now, there are many other parts. I'm going to kind of fly through a couple of things. I'm going to stop at one more very important place. I mean, they're all important places. There's so many different parts of this museum that are really important to know about. But actually, this is one that I want to spend more time in, and the other ones we'll kind of do more quickly just for the sake of time. This place was not originally built at the beginning of the museum. This was built in the 90s, and this is called Yad Yeled. Basically a memorial for the children. And if you've been to Yad Vashem, you know that Yad Vashem has a Yad Yeled there. This is a very different one because this is actually a children's museum. This is a Holocaust museum specifically designed and built for children to come in and as children to learn about the Holocaust, to think about the Holocaust, to discuss the Holocaust, to try to feel the emotions, the experience of the Jews who went through the Holocaust. Here are just some pictures of the inside of the building, but we're actually going to get to see this really amazing short video, all right, about it that really shows us this inside look at the Yad Yeled, at the Children's Memorial here at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum. So I'm going to again share my screen with another YouTube clip. Okay, this one is in Hebrew. It's short. I'm going to translate most of it. Okay, hold on one second. So I'm going to basically I'm going to turn the volume down or low of the clip, and I will just kind of, do a free form kind of translation of what's being said in the video. I hope that works for everybody. Okay, but it's such an important place to see here at the Ghetto Fighters Museum. So let me just lower the volume a little bit. Okay, and let me move this up over here. And I hope the video flows smoothly. Let's begin. And I hope you hear my voice well as well. So here's this boy who's kind of guiding us there. Right, his name is Mayan Eloni. And he's going inside to the museum. Right, and he wants... Right, saying that we're inviting you to an emotional journey to understand the experience of children specifically in the Holocaust. He says, hi, Anat.
מה הוויטראז'ים האלה?
הוויטראז'ים האלה הם מבוססים על ציורים שציירו ילדים בגטו טרזינשטט.
So I have to pause this here and just say this is so powerful. These are stained glass windows that were made out of pictures that children drew in the Theresienstadt ghetto transit camp in Poland, which maybe some of you are familiar with, right? So these pictures survived the war, and in this first room here in the Children's Memorial Museum, the Children's Museum, they have stained glass windows made, from these pictures that these Jewish children in the Holocaust drew during their Holocaust experience. You can see their dreams. Right? They look free like butterflies. So you're saying that this is the only museum in Israel and in the world that was made specifically for children, that tells the children's stories. Right, and they learn about how children specifically lived during the Holocaust times. What did they feel? What did they do? How did they deal with it? There's workshops, creative artistic workshops, theater workshops to help them really get into this learning experience. Very, very unique and important.
עכשיו קרה דבר משמח. ליהודים אסור לצאת לרחוב אחרי 8 בערב. יש עוד המון דברים אחרים שאסור ליהודים לעשות. איזה מזל שאבא ואמא יהודים. עכשיו הם לא ילכו אחרי שאני הולך לישון.
So here's this girl, this is like from a diary that a girl wrote during the Holocaust, with her innocent understanding. She's saying, the Jews are not allowed to go into the street after a certain hour. Right? There's a lot of things that the Jews aren't allowed to do. And, she's saying, wow, how lucky my parents are Jews that they can't go out after I go to sleep. They're all mine, right? I have them to myself. Right? And this very innocent, childlike view and understanding of things. He's asking, what does the broken glass represent and symbolize? It represents Kristallnacht, as you can imagine. All the things that happened to the Jews. That the windows of their businesses were broken, their lives were broken.
אמנם הכוכב היה יפה בעיניי, אבל בכל זאת הייתי מעדיף שלא לענות כוכב צהוב.
Right, so here's this little girl again from her own diary is saying, that she was going to the office with her father, and so her mom sewed on her clothing like a yellow star and saying, oh look, now you have just like, daddy, you have a yellow star too, right? To try to make it, somewhat, not intense for her daughter. And the daughter said, wow, it's so beautiful, right? It's such a beautiful yellow star, but still, I wish I didn't have to wear one. Here's a theater workshop that they have here for kids to role play based on actual lines that kids in the Holocaust had written. I'm just going to skip a little bit again just for the sake of time. Here they're talking about the deportation of the Jews to the ghettos. And in their suitcases.
אורזים בקדחתנות חיים שלמים לתוך תרמילי גב.
רציתי לקחת את הליטן שלי, אבל אמא אמרה שמאוחר מדי. והמזוודה כבר סגורה.
So here, kids are saying, we were forced onto the streets to walk into the ghetto our entire lives, packed up in suitcases, right, and in backpacks. And this one other kid says, I said to my mom, I wanted to like pack my clown, I guess like a doll. And the mother said, sorry, it's too late. Everything's already packed to the brim. And he started to cry.
אנחנו נכנסים עכשיו לתוך הגטו, עם המשפט, אני מרגיש כמו בתוך...
So here they're going, so to speak, into the ghetto. And there's a verse there that says, I feel as if I'm in a box.
מה זה בעצם גטו?
So explaining what a ghetto is. What is a ghetto? Right? It's closed off. It's for the Jews. There's a wall around them. Right, in very, very crowded conditions. Right? There was lots of sickness and hunger. Right, she's saying that the kids in the ghetto, they used everything that they knew in order to survive the ghetto. So here in this workshop, they're learning about individual kids, and they're doing an art project around these boys or girls. Really powerful way for these kids to connect to actual Jewish children who lived through the Holocaust and most likely died, right? In order to understand the Holocaust in general, but the specific experience of individual Jews, around their age in the Holocaust. Such an important part of this museum and Holocaust education in general. Again, there's no other museum like this in the world. There's memorials to children. There's no children's museum dedicated to teaching children about the Holocaust. Here's train tracks. Here's the train tracks, and then it ends. And here the Jews would get off to their death. They have the selection, who's going to die, who's going to live, who's going to go to work, and who's going to go to death. Right? And here they literally walk over the outlines of people in order so that they don't forget them, so that they carry them with them, that these kids are told when they leave the museum that it's up to them to carry their memories and their stories with them so that they're never forgotten. So powerful, so powerful. So I just want to share a couple more things. I know we're getting late in the hour and I want to respect the time. But I want to share a couple more quick things and then we will open up to any questions or comments people want to make. One of the also very important parts of the Ghetto Fighters House Museum is downstairs in the museum. They have this model. This is a model of the Treblinka death camp, one of 6 death camps that the Nazis built in Poland. This death camp alone saw between 800,000 and 900,000 Jews killed in a very short period of time. Most of the Jews who came to this camp were dead within an hour or a few hours. This wasn't like other camps where, had a huge labor camp attached to it like Auschwitz or Majdanek. This was mostly and specifically for killing. This was surrounded by forests, so it would be hidden well. And this is a model where people can sit around. I've sat around this model many times with groups to learn about Treblinka, to learn about death camps. Here's an aerial view of the actual camp of Treblinka, all right? And Treblinka, it was destroyed by the Nazis at the end of the war, and today there's only a memorial there. You can go there and walk amongst these stones that were placed there representing, each stone represents a different community that Jews came from to Treblinka, right? And most of those communities completely wiped out as a result. I just want to say that this model was actually built by a Jewish man who was in Treblinka. He was 50 years old. Yaakov Warnick. He was 50 years old when the war started and when the Warsaw Ghetto was formed, and he was, of course, forced to live there. And he, too, on one of the first deportations in 1942, he was brought to Treblinka, and he was chosen for work. There was a selection. Most of the Jews there went right to death. Some were kept alive to do the work of the gas chambers and the pits where they burned the bodies, the cremation pits. Well, he was also a carpenter, and the Treblinka death camp in 1943, there was an uprising, and about 600 Jews, they were part of the Sonderkommando, like the workforce in the death camp. They escaped they had a plan where they smuggled weapons and they got fuel and they blew things up and they killed Nazi officers, and then they just ran. They ran for their lives outside of the camp. Most of them were gunned down by the Nazis right away or shortly after. Literally, I think it's a few dozen Jews actually survived the uprising and survived the entire war. Yaakov Wernick was one of them, and he was a carpenter. That's why actually he was kept alive in Treblinka. He worked as a carpenter for the Nazis. And again, that's why he was kept alive. He lived for a year in Treblinka before the uprising, and he escaped. He wrote a book after the war called A Year in Treblinka, right? He was there for that year. And the stories in there, I won't even mention any of them. They're so grotesque and so intense, what he saw and what he had to go through and what he had to experience. But after the war, he built this model for this museum. And it's an incredible, incredible thing, right? He, of course, built it from his memory. But really, really well done and well documented, and such a gift, right, to so many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that have visited this museum and this model to learn more about Treblinka. I want to end here. I believe this is the last thing, even if it's not. I think this is where we're going to end just for time's sake again. But another very important and powerful part of the museum is this glass box, right? What is this glass box? You might be guessing already. Right, well, this is the glass box that in the 1960s, Adolf Eichmann sat in the trial against him in the state of Israel for his crimes against the Jews and his crimes against humanity. And again, a whole story in and of itself, what he did in the war, what he did after the war, how Israel, through the Mossad, found him and captured him and brought him back to Israel. I'm not going to tell that whole story right now, but the museum here has this glass booth, this glass box, this bulletproof glass box that he sat in through the duration of the trial. He was captured by the Mossad in 1960. He was one of the masterminds of the genocide against the Jews, the deportation, the death camps, the gas, all of that was in his hands. And he was captured in 1960, put on trial in 1961. They interrogated him for a good 9 months before the trial started. And if you can see, well, we'll get to that in a second. I think I have another picture of that. This is Gideon Hausner. He was the main lawyer who represented the state of Israel and the Jewish people in this trial against Eichmann. And at the beginning of the trial, he says these words. I want to read out these words because they're so powerful. Right? He says, "When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I'm not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards him who sits in the dock and cry, 'I accuse.' For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and are strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name, I will unfold the terrible indictment." Right, so this is these are his opening words, and this is Eichmann in this bulletproof glass booth. They made it bulletproof because they imagined that someone might try to kill him, and they wanted him to stand trial, a fair and legal trial based on the Israeli justice system. There were 2 guards inside him, inside the booth with him at all times. By his cell, he was always with guards, and they made sure that those guards had no connection to the Holocaust, because they didn't want those guards to get so emotionally charged that they might injure or kill him themselves. The trial, right, was a very powerful trial for Israel. Why? Because for the first time ever, Holocaust survivors stood up and told their story. And the world was listening. Israel was listening for the first time. And they were in shock. Those who were listening were in shock. They didn't know. They didn't really understand. And it's so hard for us to understand today because we're living in a world where Holocaust education is so powerful and so deep. and so present in their lives. But in the 1960s in the world, and even in Israel, people didn't talk about it that much. Survivors didn't really tell their stories. They either believe that no one's going to believe them, or they're going to maybe even, God forbid, accuse them of walking to their deaths and being weak, or just they don't want to relive the horrors of what they went through. So they just kind of tried to move on with their lives, even though they lived the nightmare of their experience almost every single night. Right? But this trial changed all of that. Survivors stood up, they told their story, and Israelis and people around the world listened and heard, and it changed them as well. They themselves thought, wow, I didn't know. I knew something horrible happened to our people, but I didn't know to what depth. Here, my friends, this is Tzivi Lubetkin, right? Who we learned about just a little bit ago in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is Tzivi Lubetkin testifying against Eichmann at the trial. Here is Yitzchak Zuckerman testifying against Eichmann at the trial. And here's Yaakov Wernick, right, the one who built the Treblinka model, testifying at the trial against Adolf Eichmann. How amazing and how powerful is that? Right? And I want to end with one last thing. I want to go back to these two, Tzivia and Yitzchak, and I want to say, and I want to close by saying that they, as we learned before, were leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They were two of the very, very, very few survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They get out, they had to crawl through the sewers for 36 to 48 hours to get to a safe place. They ran to the forest, they joined the partisans, they survived the war, they get to Israel, they get married. They marry each other. They're part of the kibbutz that we're talking about today. They help find this kibbutz in this museum. They have children. They have 2 children. Their children have children. And guess what? Their daughter, Tzivi Lubetkin's daughter, Yitzchak Zuckerman's daughter, Roni, she becomes Israel's first ever female fighter pilot. Israel's first female fighter pilot. Talk about strength. Talk about resistance. Talk about never again. Talk about reclaiming the Jewish strength. And talk about the passing on of that strength and that pride through the generations. Their granddaughter is a symbol of all of that. And I think their granddaughter is a symbol of this kibbutz and what this kibbutz in this museum stands for. So I want to thank everybody for being here. And Julie, again, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Such an honor to be part of this very special and important presentation. And thank you. I pass it back to you.
Thank you.
Akiva, thank you so much. It was amazing. It was powerful. It was moving. It was fluent. It was everything. Every positive verb I can use here. It was just amazing. And yes, I would just want to emphasize what Akiva just said about Roni, the granddaughter of Tzivia. I remember when it was on the news, it was like the headlines, and it was so amazing for all of us Israelis. I literally think that every Israeli remembers, the event when Roni finished the pilot course, and she became the first ever female pilot of a fighting plane. So yeah, I mean, there is something in that blood, something in this family, this heritage. There is a movie which was made, I don't remember the name, but Akiva, probably you will, a movie made about the journey of the 3 granddaughters of Tzivia back to Warsaw, back to the same sewage system which saved their grandmother. You know what I'm talking about, Akiva?
I haven't seen that, but now I'm going to, so thank you. I'm going to look for that.
Okay, so there is a movie, we have to Google it, and yeah, we should watch it. Ladies and gentlemen, pardon?
Sorry, just thank you so much, Akiva. I think I was speaking for all of us and saying you're probably the most passionate presenter we've ever had. I didn't know about this museum, but I'm definitely going to go, and I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. You've gotten glowing reviews in the chat, and
thank you.
So thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Your side candle.
Yeah. Okay. And so now Julia's going to be asking the questions that are in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're about to start asking the questions. Okay. So Akiva, I'll start reading the chat. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you will be muted again. And then, as usual, when we ran out of questions on the chatting, you're welcome to keep using it. So then you will be able to unmute yourself. So let's start with the already existing questions. All right. Let me just find the very beginning. Okay. I will be just reading the questions, maybe not all the remarks. There are quite many of those. Okay, now actually I'm reading the whole stuff to find the question. Okay, who took the photos of the Warsaw Ghetto? Question of Stanley. Who took the photos of the Warsaw Ghetto we saw in the presentation?
Great question. So, can you guys hear me okay? I hear like a little bit of an echo. Yeah, okay. So the Germans took a lot of pictures. The Nazis themselves, as you might know, were very into documenting and keeping records. So a lot of the pictures in general from the Holocaust, including the Warsaw Ghetto, were from their own files. But in addition, there were pictures taken by Jews who were there. I mean, Jews lived there. They had their stuff. When they were forced to go into the ghetto, they had that one suitcase or a couple of suitcases, that they were allowed to bring, for a whole family. Maybe you had like a wagon that they were wheeling through the street. And in 15 minutes time, if anyone's ever seen Schindler's List, that moment where the Jews are forced out of their apartment, and they're given 15 minutes to collect whatever they want to bring, and they're grabbing pictures, and they're grabbing, Shabbat candlesticks and family heirlooms and mezuzahs, and the Jews had to choose what are they going to bring with them and leave everything else behind. So some of them, brought cameras and were able to actually take pictures and even document life. And I'll say this, and I'm so glad this question was asked, because it just sparked the memory that I have to bring up. And this question allows me to share this. There was something called Oneg Shabbat. All right, it was a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. He was a historian. And he took it upon himself. He formed a group of people around him. He created a group called Oneg Shabbat. You might know Oneg Shabbat as like, Friday night activities, the youth group, synagogue. Well, they called themselves Oneg Shabbat because they would get together once a week on Friday night, and they would share with each other the different artifacts that they found and came across throughout the week. Those could have been underground newspapers. Those could have been diary entries. They could have been tickets. Yes, tickets being sold to theater productions in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We didn't even get to that, right? But the cultural life in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was tremendous. We can even look at that as a spiritual resistance. And they put on theater productions. So this organization, Oneg Shabbat, collected all these things and documented. And amongst their artifacts were many pictures. They put them in these tin boxes, or these metal boxes, and these milk cans, and they buried them in the earth of the Warsaw Ghetto, and those were found actually after the war. And they found 3 of them, and they knew it was either they found 2 and they knew there was a 3rd, or they found 3 and they knew there was a 4th, just from things that were said in the other boxes that were found. And they didn't know where that missing one was. And guess where it was found? It was found in the attic of the Ghetto Fighters Museum. Right? It was actually placed there, and people forgot about it, and eventually found it. And this really opens up our understanding and our knowledge of the Warsaw Ghetto, including those pictures, some of those pictures.
Okay. There is a question. Actually, Mark Katzman wrote, "Let's not forget Pavel Frankel and Betar." So maybe you can say something about it.
There's a million details to always, say about anything, any topic in Jewish history, and of course the Holocaust, right? But I mentioned super briefly that the uprising itself was a collection of different organizations and groups, political organizations, Zionist affiliations. So Beitar was there, and Beitar was one of them. And the strange thing was that even in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising itself, there wasn't a perfect and clear unity amongst these different groups fighting the Nazis, that there was some kind of, because they had such ideological differences between them, whether it's, Beitar or the Bund and all these different groups. So there wasn't a perfect cohesiveness. But yes, we do have different groups, Beitar being one of them for sure, and fighting, along their kind of ideological lines and fighting for, for their futures that they wanted to create. But of course, what they did have in common was fighting the Nazis, and that was the most important thing.
Okay. Well, Neil wrote also not forget about the Ringelblum archive, documents and diaries hidden and buried in milk cans. Well, another thing you did not mention because you did not have the time. I totally understand. Okay, so in such a case, let's see other more specific questions. Okay, you were asked to post the name of the movie.
I posted the movie.
And you posted it later.
Okay. And the link, but I couldn't find the one, the Hebrew one of the child. If you wanted to post it,
I'll post it right now. Hold on, let me copy paste the thing.
Thank you.
I'll put it into the Zoom chat. This is the. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to make sure it goes to everyone. Here we go. This is in Hebrew about the Children's Museum. Did it go in? Did anyone see that? Did it go in? There it is.
There it is, yeah.
Okay. And I'll also post the other one I showed of Uprising. It's a very long movie. Oh, you did? Great. Okay. It's like a 3-hour movie, but amazing.
I didn't get to it yet. Okay. Harry asked, how did any Polish partisans join the Warsaw Uprising? Again, how many survived the Warsaw Ghetto?
Okay, so first of all, the whole story of resistance in the Holocaust, especially in Poland, is so interesting because you have the Polish resistance and you have the Jewish resistance. And while there at times they were very separate, there were times and places and ways where they overlapped. First of all, I think it's really important to know that the Warsaw, I didn't mention this, there's so many facts, part of the story, you can't mention everything, but it's very important to mention that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the largest uprising against the Nazis in the entire war, right? And it inspired many other uprisings and revolts by the Jews in other ghettos and in camps, and also by non-Jews. In fact, the Warsaw Uprising, there's the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and then there's the Warsaw Uprising of the non-Jewish Poles, right? The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising inspires the Warsaw Uprising, right? So that's an important thing to know as well. I'll just mention really quickly, I had an older cousin when I was growing up. We called her Anne Freju. She was from Poland. I called her Anne just because we were very close with her, but she was, my grandparents' age. And she escaped the shtetl on the first day that the Nazis came to my family's shtetl and basically killed everybody. She was able to actually escape. It's a crazy story. I'm not going to go into all the details, but she escaped. And because she had blonde hair and blue eyes, she ran and hid throughout the entire Holocaust. Different story every 6 months. And one of the last things she did was she actually worked in the kitchen. I worked in the kitchen for the workers who were cleaning up the Warsaw Ghetto, cleaning up from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And then from there, she kind of got thrown into the Warsaw Uprising. Even though she was a Jew, she was posing as a non-Jew, and she got arrested, or she got captured by the Nazis and sent to a camp, not as a Jew, but as a Pole. Right? The Nazis didn't know that she was Jewish even then. She spent about a year in a camp at the end of the war. Thank God she survived, obviously. But I'm just sharing that as part of the bigger picture of the uprising. So yeah, there were some Poles that helped the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto to smuggle in weapons. They did not have a lot of weapons. It's kind of a big topic of did the Poles do enough? It's a whole big question I'm not going to get into. I'll just say, maybe I think it's important to hear, after having been in Poland now around a dozen times and talking to Polish people and just being there and really feeling it out, and actually reading a lot about Polish history, it's really important to know, as we learn about our own history and about the Holocaust and the Jewish suffering in World War II and the Shoah, the Holocaust, that the Poles suffered immensely as well, the non-Jewish Poles. Right? Almost the same amount of non-Jewish Poles were killed by the Nazis or the war as Jewish Poles. There 3 million Jewish Poles were murdered by the Nazis in the war, and almost the same, between 2 and 3 million Poles, non-Jewish Poles, were killed as well. So that's a kind of a big story of what did they do, what could they do, what did they know about, what they didn't. It's a big kind of area of study and research and discussion. But you definitely see some Poles helping out the Jews specifically here in this Warsaw Ghetto Uprising with guns, and then afterwards, helping them to escape. The partisans, we didn't even touch the partisans. That's like a whole nother topic. The museum has an incredible section dedicated to the partisans, right? The freedom fighters in the forests. There were about 100,000 Jewish partisans in the war. Some of them were, in Polish non-Jewish partisan groups, some of the only Jews in those groups. Some of them were in all Jewish partisan groups, and some were in mixed Jewish and Polish partisan groups. Of the 100,000 Jewish partisans that there were fighting from the forest, only 30,000 survive, right? But that is one place where the Poles and the Jews did sometimes overlap.
There is, thank you for the prolonged answer. There is a recommendation by Neil, an excellent film of Warsaw Ghetto is a film unfinished, okay? Just if you don't read the chat, so this is a recommended movie. All right, we already made the link thing, appraisal. Okay, I'm looking for more questions. Okay. Brown wrote, Holocaust education is in U.S. public schools can be very poor as dependent on teachers' knowledge and sensibility. Has anyone thought of adapting these children program to educate non-Jewish children? I'm not sure this is the question for Akiva. Maybe this is more of a question for the U.S. Educational authorities, but I don't know, Akiva, do you have any input on that?
I think it's a great idea. I think somebody should do it for sure. I think even the Jewish education of the Holocaust is pretty limited in America, even though we spend so much money in memorials and in museums. I think the actual education that kids are getting in America is pretty shallow, and it sounds like a very judgmental statement. I'm sorry if it does come across that way, but I know that from experience from working with Jewish teens from America for about 20 years now. And when they come to the program where I used to teach, in 3 days we would teach them more than they learned their entire upbringing. A very amazing exception to that is Australia. As you might know, Australia has an incredible Holocaust education system. And the first time I ever worked with an Australian group here visiting Israel, they could finish every single sentence I said. That's how deep their Holocaust education was. So we see, and from the Australian Jewish day schools that it is possible. It is possible to have a very deep and thorough Holocaust education by the time these kids become teenagers, which I think is not really happening in America. Could and should, but that's up to to other people.
Okay. Okay. There is a recommendation made by Pam. There is a twinning program for bar and bat mitzvah children from overseas. A twinning program when they celebrate their bar bat mitzvah as if together with or instead of a Jewish teenager who did not survive the Holocaust. So if you have grandchildren of an appropriate age, you're welcome to contact Yad Vashem and make this very meaningful, not easy though, program. Well, it should not be easy. Okay, let's see if we have more.
Warsaw Zoo and the Zookeeper's Daughter.
Was there a question?
Yeah, if you could comment on the Warsaw Zoo. Hi.
Hi.
If you could comment on the Warsaw Zoo and the Zookeeper's Daughter, a wonderful story of what happened with the zoo in Warsaw at the time.
I will be honest with you. I've heard of that book. I've never read it. So it's, there's so many pieces and parts of the Holocaust and the Warsaw Ghetto as well. So that's one that I'm less familiar with. So I apologize that I can't really answer to an appropriate depth on that one.
Watch the movie.
Watch the movie.
On TV today about 10 times. So.
Yeah.
Julia, somebody asked a question about the significance of the cylinder shape, and I wondered that too.
Okay, so I did not find this question. Okay, thank you for helping me. So, Akiva, what is the significance of the spiral shape of Yad LaYeled?
So they model that after buildings throughout history, Jewish and non-Jewish actually, that have that kind of shape, that rotunda shape of religious significance, of memorial significance. So it was really modeled after many buildings, going back even thousands of years ago, and found that shape was an appropriate parallel to what they were trying to create here. Create a space, almost like a sacred space, like that shape was used for in other buildings in other times. I would also even add, just on a creative note, just like this idea of like a kind of like a spiral, that you kind of get inside of it deeper and deeper and deeper, and on some level there's like no way out. And while of course, thank God, we know that there are many survivors, for most of the Jews in the Holocaust there wasn't, and there was no exit, and there was no way out. And this idea of just kind of going deeper and deeper into that experience, and you can't really see what's happening around the corner. You can't really see what's in front of you. It's not like a straight path where you can see in the distance. It's always like a mystery. And that's, I think, when of course we can't ever get into the mindset of a person, of a Jew, of a non-Jew that experienced these horrors in the Holocaust and World War II. Right? Still, on some level, we try. But one thing to remember is that we know everything, in 2020 hindsight, so to speak. But what they knew was only like, so to speak, a few feet in front of them. So I think that's also part of that symbolism.
Okay, Akiva, there is a question by Esther about Shumeria. The place was first referred to as Shumeria. I'm talking about the kibbutz Lochomei HaGetoot. So if you can explain the name.
That's like a whole nother topic. I don't think it has to do with like people and places in the land at the end of the War of Independence. So that's a name that was of an Arab village in the area during the War of Independence in 1948 that went into 1949.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, right now I don't see any further questions. So if you do have a question or anything you'd like to share, you can please unmute yourself and talk to us. Talk to Akiva if you're still there.
Julia, I have a comment regarding education.
Yes, Larry.
Holocaust education is only required in 5 states in this country. And I don't know what they are. I can't remember what they are. But
New Jersey,
New York, California, Florida, and I don't remember the other. But there is an organization. There's an organization in Philadelphia called the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center. And they send survivors out to different schools around the Philadelphia area. And with Zoom, they're now doing it throughout the country. But they also recognize how there's very little education, but they are trying, and they seem to be getting actual response from the community, both Jews and non-Jews.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that in my congregation there was a woman of blessed memory who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she spoke to schools all over North Carolina, from the coast to the mountains, every place in between, of her experiences. She married, she moved to North Carolina, she raised 2 children. Before she passed, she was just a magnificent influence. Right now, there are second-generation Holocaust representatives who are going around the state of North Carolina. It was just made a law in the state to teach an entire unit on the Holocaust, not just a chapter of a book, but an entire unit. And the big discussion now is whether we're going to include Black Lives Matter and all the other marginalized people in with it. So all I can say is, nothing is ever ending and there's no clear answer. But North Carolina has started this. I have been, until his passing, in a very strong relationship with a man who was born in Poland and spent the war in a war camp at Auschwitz. And he spent the last 6 years of his life going all over the state, especially to Army bases. He went to all the bases in North Carolina, speaking to the soldiers, telling them of his experiences.
The Holocaust Museum in Philadelphia was started by a Holocaust survivor, Jacob Rees, who collected a lot of Holocaust things and kept it in his basement. And he kept it in his basement for about 10 years. And then finally, Philadelphia funded a little bit of it and started it. And now they have all the Holocaust survivors going around to different schools to talk to them. Obviously, there were many more at that time. There are very few left.
Now, Jacob Rees' son was a student of my husband's at Fells Junior High. And the person who took it over was Chuck Feldman, who became an activist to the cause and went to Fells Junior High. So it's around, it's here and it's thriving. They're going to have a Zoom tonight at 7:30, which of course we're going to watch. And we're sorry, terribly sorry about the Holocaust, but it gives us nachas that this Holocaust Survivors Museum exists.
We have to keep getting the word out. There can be no more silence when it comes to the Holocaust.
Does anyone else have a question for Akiva in his presentation?
Yeah, I want to tell Akiva about Ringelbaum Archive. Is he here? Akiva?
I'm here.
Yes, Akiva, hi.
Hi.
I have a yahrzeit candle. So I saw, there is a movie and I saw it called Who Will Tell Our History? And that's all about Oneg Shabbat and Ringelbaum and his circle and all the archive which they found after.
Yeah,
So
no, it's an incredible part of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust in general. I'll just really quickly share that a couple of years ago, I had the incredible merit on one of my trips to Poland in Warsaw to go to, I forget the official name of it, but they basically have like a Holocaust archives building there. And I think it's named after Ringelblum himself. And because I was on a learning mission in that specific trip, I wasn't teaching students. I went with other educators and we were receiving kind of like advanced training in our teaching there. And they actually brought us into the archives room of the archives there. And they showed us original documents from Oneg Shabbat. I have to tell you, it was, as an educator, it was one of the most powerful moments in my life as an educator to see original documents. I've been learning about it, teaching about it, sharing about it for so many years, and to see original documents from Oneg Shabbat, from the Warsaw Ghetto, was a whole other thing. It was unbelievable.
make sure you see the movie, Who Will Tell Our History?
Great, thank you.
Will come up to your museum.
Any questions for Akiva?
Yes. Akiva, do you do tours to Warsaw for adults or only for young people and educators?
Up until now, I've only done it for high school student groups, but I'm making major shifts and transformations in my life and professional career right now and this past year. So, while I've been doing a lot of new work here in Israel and about Israel and a ton of online education about Israel, I'll actually drop my website in the comments there for people to have. But one of the things I'm looking to doing is to getting back to Poland to lead groups for any and all age groups. It's a weird thing to say, but I find it really, really meaningful. I don't want to use the word like because it sounds kind of strange, but I really like going to Poland. I find it incredibly important and significant and meaningful to go there and to lead groups there. So that was the long answer for the very short answer. That my hope is yes, I would love to lead adult groups as well. And so if you have a group that you'd like to bring, you can be in touch with me. I'm going to drop my personal information here in the group chat for people to see.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Akiva, let me ask you a question. I know a couple of friends of mine have gone on tours in Poland with guides, and they've actually experienced a lot of anti-Semitism just being on the tour, walking in the streets, people yelling at them, throwing things. Have you ever experienced that?
Specifically in Poland?
Yes. Like they will go back.
Really?
on 2 different separate trips.
I have to say, like I said before, I've been there about 12 times, if not more. And fortunately, I've never experienced that. I've never experienced anti-Semitism. And you know, look how I look. You know, I got like a kippah on my head and I got a beard, and I let my tzitzit, you know, fly out. I'm very open with my Jewish appearance and identity there. And I've never had any negative experience. I've talked to guides about that. Yeah. And it's incredible because so clearly it does happen because, you know, what you just said, but I've spoken to guides who say, ironically, Poland is probably, you know, one of the safest countries for Jews these days in Europe. And it's not perfectly safe, clearly, but it's compared to many of the other countries, it's one of the safest. And they have said that they have been with groups where there have been issues, but a lot of times they use the word hooligans. There are these hooligans that just make trouble with all kinds of people. And so that's what sometimes these groups experience. But again, I've never experienced that. And I'll let you know, when I'm in Poland with a group on Shabbat, I get like really excited, and I'll get onto the streets of Warsaw. Or Krakow. Usually we spend Shabbat in Krakow, actually. I'm on the streets in Krakow with my students, and we're dancing and we're singing, and I've never had a problem. And sometimes the Polish people join us even. It's really, really sweet.
Yeah, I know about the resurgence there, but the Jewish slurs and everything, I was a little surprised. But now,
yeah, I never experienced that, fortunately.
Yeah, good.
Akiva, there is a question. Gail asked, do you think there are any more buried documents? Have ground penetrating cameras being used in the area?
Do I think that there's still documents buried from the Holocaust? Is that the question?
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, it feels like every few years you're hearing about something else that they dug up in Warsaw or in a camp because they're doing construction in Warsaw. Something recently, I forgot what it was, but you know, Warsaw specifically because the city itself is built in the rubble of the war. Literally, when you go there, like the city was like flattened by the Germans. And so it literally sits on the rubble of the war. And every now and then they still find things, remnants of Jewish life specifically. So I would not doubt if there are things still hidden. And the stories of those things that were hidden and were found later are just unbelievable, inspiring. I have a book on my shelf here, my house, written by again, we didn't get to everything. We can't get to everything, but there was a special rabbi. He was known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe. I'm not going to tell his whole story right now for time's sake, but he taught and he inspired against German Nazi law. And he became like people's like spiritual kind of guide in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he wrote all kinds of thoughts about the Torah portion, the weekly Torah portion for 2 years, the first 2 years of the ghetto's existence. He was one of the first ones to be liquidated and killed in Treblinka. He buried his manuscript in the ground. It was found by, I think it was an American soldier, right? In this like, amongst all the rubble in this piece of like, clay or, ceramics, whatever it was. It was a miracle that he didn't just throw it to the side. He gave it to somebody to decipher. The person saw that it was Hebrew, passed it on to another person, and then finally got into the hands of someone who could read and understand the Hebrew. And the first page of the manuscript said, I'm not alive, but surely there are still Jews alive in the land of Israel. Please, I have a brother there. Make sure this manuscript gets to him, all right, in Tel Aviv. And they actually got it to his brother. His brother published the book, and you can buy the book now. And I have that book on my shelf. It's an unbelievable thing. Beautiful. So yes, again, a long answer for a very direct question. I do believe that there are still things and that we will still see those things being found over the years to come.
All right. Well, Akiva, I must thank you now because as I look at my my cell phone, it's 10:40 p.m., which means that we spend 40, well, Israeli time, yeah.
Yeah,
That means
sorry,
yeah, and that means, well, for Kim and myself, listen, and that means that we spend about 40 minutes of Q's and A's, which is amazing. And I think this is, yeah, I'm sure this is the longest we ever had. Which of course is because you're such a good lecturer and because of the significance of the topic. So I'm sure that there's so many more questions and answers and things to discuss. I mean, this is a never-ending story. But I think I really feel that I have to let Akiva go, go to bed or do whatever you feel like. So Akiva, thank you so much. It is highly, amazingly appreciated. And,
really, thank you. If I can just say, Julia, thank you again. All those WhatsApps were, well worth it.
We're exchanging WhatsApps, and well, we should have a coffee once upon a time in the
I would like
Mosheva.
that.
I am there great. Like the other day, and
yeah, there's some good coffee shops in Partisans. And really, just thank you, Julie, and thank you, everybody. Really, I have to just say, for me, this was a very special part of my Yom HaShoa experience this year, and it's just such a gift to be able to share with everybody. So thank you for your participation, your questions, and just your presence here. So thank you so much.
I told you, they're an amazing audience.
Amazing, you're
תודה רבה, לילה טוב, עקיבא, אנחנו נהיה בקשר. תודה רבה.
אני אשמח להתראות, ביי ביי.
Wow.
Yeah, that was real powerful. I'm really happy. Well, that's the difference between when you have somebody who you either know personally or who was recommended by somebody you trust, which is the case with Akiva. I did not know him personally, but Sharona, you all know her, my friend and colleague, and she worked with him for a couple of years. So when I asked her if she has an accommodation, she said Akiva, and so it was like, well, it was a bingo.
Thank you.
So, I really apologize that the speaker the other day was not as good as this one, but I'm talking about Rabbi Museum, but I could not choose because it was on behalf of the museum. So, you contact the center and then they will send you a guide. So I had no input on that.
This one made up for it, Julia. It's wonderful.
I know it was indeed great. And again, I thought it will be, I just want to share something personal. He said that this presentation and whatever we had here was a very powerful day of his Holocaust Day, which we're all, today at 8 a.m. there was the siren he mentioned, which happens like every year. So anyhow, it happened that today I was guiding a group of tour guide course students, people who are starting to become tour guides, and it happened to be a tour focused on Christianity in the area of the Sea of Galilee, which is my specialization anyhow. So we ended up sitting, well, I knew that it's going to happen, so the whole thing was planned, and we ended up sitting at an altar, not inside a church, but like outside of a beautiful church of Mount of Beatitudes. Anyhow, we were the only group there because it is a Catholic church, which is normally like full and packed, but now there are no tourists, and so we were the only group there, so they let us use the altar, which is normally used for prayers, for Christian prayers, and we placed, let me just share my screen for a sec. All right, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the group, and this is an altar. This is an actual altar, which is normally uses for masses. And we placed the 6 Yortzeit candles here, which is customary in Israel, to put 1 candle for 1 million Jews. And here we are sitting and waiting for the siren to start. And then there was the siren, we stood up, and then we had a very short memorial ceremony. And then we sang the Hatikva, and that was the end of the ceremony. And then we proceeded with the Christian-oriented tour. And it was so powerful.
What a tour for Yom HaShoa. Wow.
I know, amazing. I think that, I was the guide. They have a coordinator I don't think the coordinator actually realized that it's gonna be on Yom HaShoa, this specific tour, you know, but of course is a course, and anyhow, there was nothing wrong in visiting churches on this day, but having the Yahrzeit candles on the altar of a Catholic church was a very special experience.
Julia,